and we will open the conversation at the end to your questions. The virtual platform is allowing us to meet our speaker today, Edyta Gawron, PhD, a historian and assistant professor at the Institute of Jewish Studies. Uh, Jag- oh my God, you have to help me with that, Edyta.
Jagiellonian or Jagiellonian?
Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and the former director of the Center of the Study of the History and Culture of Krakow Jews. She is president of the management board of Galicia Jewish Heritage Institute Foundation and served on the team that designed the historical museum in Oskar Schindler's factory in Krakow. Good to have you here, Edyta.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to speak this morning or tonight in Poland, in Krakow. And I'm thrilled to see all the guests, including some friends who I would like to welcome. Hello, Elizabeth. Hello, Jonathan Weber. Professor Weber has been one of the key persons for Galicia Jewish Museum all the years since the beginning, and I'm happy to see Jonathan as well. I'm happy to see everyone who is joining today for the event. Let me share the screen and start the presentation. Just to make it smooth, to say a few words at the beginning. It's going to be a short lecture for about 40, maximum 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. And I was asked to talk today about the influence of Polish Jews on Polish culture and art. We are focusing on the period after the Holocaust, but it's hard to start after the Holocaust, once most of the people who are active shaping Polish culture and having Jewish background were born earlier and had some experience before the Holocaust. So I will start.
Wait, stop.
So I will start a little bit earlier. And forgive me if I share some basic facts that are known for people who are more advanced, but I think some of you might enjoy some basic information as well. So first of all, we are going to talk about Polish Jews. Polish Jews, some of them were born before the Second World War, some of them were born after the Second World War, and their identity was shaped not only by their upbringing at home, but also by the situation in Poland, by their personal experience and the environment they grew up in. Poland, before the Second World War, had the largest population, Jewish population in Europe. Approximately 3.5 million Jews lived in Poland. And it was an incredible place with the diversity of Jewish life and many centers of Jewish culture or Polish culture with Jewish input as well. And in this Polish environment before the Second World War, we could also, of course, identify Jews who were religious, Orthodox, but also those who were progressive, reform, however you name it, but also those who were secular, assimilated, and those who converted to Christianity. So there was the whole spectrum of Jewish identity, and very often this Jewish identity was also fluent, especially in the intellectual circles of Poland. As an introduction, let me read a short paragraph from the text written by a young Jewish man, Abraham Rothfarb, who was writing about his identity for the for the competition organized by YIVO. And he wrote, "I'm a poor assimilated soul. I'm a Jew and a Pole. Or rather, I was a Jew, but gradually, under the influence of my environment, under the influence of the place where I lived, and under the influence of the language, the culture, and the literature, I have also become a Pole. I love Poland, its language, its culture, and most of all, the fact that its liberation and the heroism of its independence struggle all pluck at my heartstrings and fire my feelings and enthusiasm. But I do not love that Poland, which for no apparent reason hates me, that Poland, which tears at my heart and soul, which drives me into the state of apathy, melancholy, and dark depression. Poland has taken away my happiness. It has turned me into a dog who, not having any ambitions of his own, asks only not to be abandoned in the wasteland of culture, but to be drawn along the road of Polish cultural life. Poland has brought me as a Pole, but brands me as a Jew who has to be driven out. I want to be a Pole. You have not let me. I want to be a Jew, but I don't know how. I have become alienated from Jewishness. This short paragraph shows the complexity of identity, the difficulties in pre-war Poland, and certainly it could be shared at that point by many Jews who lived in Poland, including people like Jan Marcin Schanzer and several other intellectuals who were shaping Polish Jewish circles of artists, writers, journalists, and many more. And certainly in the pre-war Poland, there was a group of intellectuals who were active in these mixed societies, but some of them were also active as Poles in the Polish society, but at in certain circumstances, they were reminded of their Jewishness. And of course, the Jewishness of some people is being questioned today. What makes you Jewish in the context of this intellectual milieu? Is it just being born to the Jewish family, or it's your conscious identification? And in case of people like Schanze, we do not get the clear answer. Because he was strongly identifying with Polishness, but he also was working and living in the Polish Jewish society. And of course, with his family background, he was very often associated with the Jewish community or with the Jewish people at all. And of course, those of you who have visited the Schanzer exhibition have had a chance to read a little bit more about Schanzer, who was a talented artist, who lived through the 20th century, who lived through the various epochs in the Jewish history. And I think his biography is both the great scenario for the film, but it also shows the experience of many Polish Jews, people who were born before the First World War, when Poland didn't exist, who identified themselves with Polishness, and later on, after the First World War, suddenly found out what it means to be a Polish in the independent state, and also to be part of this new world, new situation, and being able to shape what was considered Polish culture, Polish state, Polish society. And of course, Schanzer was one of many. I will mention a few names, but it was difficult to select just few names from the hundreds of names that should be mentioned today. So let me just mention people like Jan Brzechwa, who was one of the most known and most talented Polish writers, poets, and certainly known for his writings for children. And here are just some examples of the titles. I left them in Polish, so you can use it as sort of tongue twisters for practicing Polish or just learning the basic titles of Jan Brzechwa. Jan Brzechwa, like many others who were born in the Jewish families or in the families of Jewish background, struggled with their identity in the interwar period. In some circles, they were considered Polish and treated as such. In some circles, they were identified with their Jewishness, and when it was convenient, they were almost cursed for their Jewishness. Nevertheless, they had enormous impact on Polish literary world. They were publishing in Polish, they were presenting in Polish, they were involved in shaping the new Polish literature. And it's hard to imagine Polish interwar literary world without people like Jan Brzechwa, but also without people like Julian Tuwim, who is known today to many because of his writings, again, for children, but who was active before and after the Second World War, also as a writer, journalist, poet, and activist as well. So these writers, Brzechwa, Tuwim, and also Antoni Słonimski, were writing in Polish. They were living on, I would say, on the edge of so-called Polish and so-called Jewish world, because they were intertwined. They were together, existing, especially when the intellectual circles are concerned. And they struggled enormously before the Second World War, because on one hand, they were considered one of the most influential, the most talented Polish writers. But at the same time, they were considered as the Jewish influence into the Polish literature or on Polish literature, and especially some radical right-wing activists and literary critics that were sort of condemning them for bringing this Jewish spirit into the Polish literature. So certainly it was both personal and professional struggle for those authors before the Second World War. And it didn't make it easier for them during the Second World War, with all the anti-Semitism and dramatic circumstances for all the Jews and all the Poles of Jewish background, because the Nazi regime also included some of those who converted to Christianity as the Jews as well. And here we see some images that, in a sense, bring together at least the three names that I mentioned before. Here are the books with the illustrations by Marcin Schanzer, but written by, for example, Julian Tuwim or Jan Brzechwa. But Schanzer was also illustrating the books written by Polish authors, Polish national poets. And here we have the examples of Adam Mickiewicz's book, or Ignacy Krasicki's book, the well-known Polish authors whose books were illustrated by Schanzer. All the names that I mentioned so far were contributing to promotion of Polish literature, of creating Polish literature, and they were certainly benefiting from the education that was available for the Jews in the interwar period. But I would like to also mention the Jews who were the pioneers in getting access to academic education in Poland, especially in the artistic life, artistic circles. And one of them was Maurycy Gottlieb, who was certainly much more associated with traditional religious Jewish community, but at the same time he was studying with one of the most famous and most talented Polish painter, Jan Matejko. So here we see his painting that was a tribute to Jewish life, but his artworks were created under supervision or with some support from the Polish colleagues and Polish artists as well. Another person that was working in the interwar Poland, which connected Jewish world and Polish ethnic world, was Bruno Schulz, again very talented writer and artist, also involved in documenting Jewish life, but at the same time, very avant-garde writing, very progressive political views, and many other things that identified him as, on one hand, a Polish writer, but on the other hand, his Jewish upbringing, his life in the Jewish community, at the same time identifies him as a Jewish artist and Jewish writer. And I think this discussion, whether Bruno Schulz was Jewish or Polish, Polish and Jewish, or Polish Jewish, has been continuing for years, and even recently when his artworks are being found, it's always the returning question of who has the right to his heritage, to his artworks, who should possess it. So I mentioned just a few names from the interwar Poland to give you an idea of the richness of Jewish intellectual circles in pre-war Poland, and certainly this is just the small part of the artists, intellectuals, writers who were working in pre-war Poland, and there is more to be mentioned. All of them had less or more contributed to Polish culture, Polish literature, the development of some structures, the criticism of what was being done before and during the interwar period. And of course, if we touch the topic of what happened to this artist during the Holocaust, it would be at least another lecture. That's why I allowed myself to skip this period, but not completely. I mean, it would be really an interesting discussion about what happened to Polish Jewish intellectuals during the Second World War, but the list of their experience during the Holocaust is as long as the list of individuals. So I think you will understand why I do not focus on this. The result of the Holocaust for Polish intellectual world, Polish Jewish intellectual world, was very dramatic. That's the least I can say. Of course, it was a tragedy for Polish Jews to lose approximately 90% of its population, and that included also some Polish Jewish artists, writers, intellectuals, teachers, academics, scientists. I could list many of them. And those who survived the Holocaust, some of them returned to Poland, Some of them immediately emigrated, whether it was from Soviet Union or western part of Europe, and they never came back to Poland. Usually, and this is kind of a pattern, usually those who came back to Poland and stayed in Poland for longer after the Holocaust, they identified themselves strongly as either Polish Jews or Poles. The number of Polish Jews who stayed in Poland after the war was approximately, the maximum number was 250,000. And of course, many of those who returned, who stayed in Poland, were assimilated Jews, were those who were educated in pre-war Poland, who contributed to the pre-war Poland, and who wanted to continue their life in Poland after the Holocaust as well. But of course, the identity of those who returned to Poland was very often changing. After the experience of the Holocaust, after reflecting on pre-war anti-Semitism, after reflecting on pre-war Jewish life as well, many Polish Jews decided, especially after the experience of the Holocaust, to remain on so-called their Jewish, their non-Jewish identity, so with so-called Aryan names, non-Jewish name. Some of them never registered as Jews after the war, just to become sort of anonymous as the Jews. And Poland itself was changing as well. Poland after the Second World War was not the same as it was before the Second World War. Just to mention the loss of approximately 6 million citizens, but also the change of the borders and the change of political situation and the communist regime that lasted till 1989. So what about this Polish Jews or Poles of Jewish background who decided to stay in Poland and be creative and shape Polish culture then? They, of course, had to take under consideration some obstacles, like the attacks on them because of their Jewish background. They had to consider being more Polish than the Poles were. And they were trying to find their own ways in the post-war Poland. Some of them became involved in commemoration of the Holocaust. Like this was their tribute to the Jewish heritage, Jewish family members who perished. And this was like the expression of Jewish identity as well. At the same time, they were doing other things related to their Polishness or their share of Polish culture. And here we have just the example of commemorating the Holocaust on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto with one of the artists, Nathan Rappaport, working on the memorial commemorating it. But there were other examples in other cities when Jewish artists were trying to commemorate the Holocaust and commemorate the Second World War as well in general. With the memorials, but also with the books, with the drawings, with the artworks, just to mention the works published by the Jewish Historical Commission. And that was very interesting process, how and why many people were commemorating the Holocaust, documenting the Holocaust, and also making sure that the history of the Holocaust was known not only to the Jews, to the Polish Jews in particular, but also to non-Jewish Poles. And at this point, I would like to mention the group of Jewish lawyers and Jewish historians who were testifying at the various trials, post-war trials, and who were making sure that Jewish history, including the history of the Holocaust, was known, was acknowledged and was considered during the trial and commemoration process. So I think it was their effort to incorporate the tragedy of Polish Jews into the narrative on the Second World War that very often, based on the communist narrative, put Polish Jews in the same group as Polish citizens. So there was no special recognition of the fate of Polish Jews in the Soviet narrative that we, for example, see at the museum, at the site of the former Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. But of course, there were other forms of commemorating the past, reflecting on the past, and one of them was film. And there was a group, quite impressive group of filmmakers, many of them survived the Second World War in the Soviet Union, who returned to Poland and who worked together or separately, individually, on commemorating both the Holocaust, but also Jewish life in general in Poland. And at the same time, they combined this work, their tribute to the Jewish past, with their contribution to Polish culture. And I think one of the most intriguing person in this immediate post-Holocaust period is Alexander Ford, who was a well-known film director, film producer, and he was also the key figure, decision maker after the Second World War in the film world in Poland in general. Before the Second World War, he was involved in producing the films that could be considered as iconic Jewish films, like here I mentioned The Children Must Laugh, or in Polish Droga Młodych, which is a very important film documenting the part of Jewish history in the interwar period. But after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, he, besides two of his early films, Majdanek, Cemetery of Europe, and Border Street, he decided to focus also on other topics. And he contributed, for example, to promoting Polish national literature, and he created one of the most iconic films titled The Knights of the Teutonic Order, in Polish Krzyżacy. So he was living and creating in the two milieus and in the two worlds. But I mentioned his name also for another reason. He was approached by several filmmakers after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, the filmmakers who were Jewish and who wanted to create Jewish films. And he was basically reacting with huge skepticism to their ideas. He said, why to create Jewish films? There are not so many Polish Jews left. We should create movies that are more universal. So he was not so much in favor of creating Jewish films, documenting, but also creating new film pieces. He wanted to sort of melt in the Jewish culture, and that was the impression that Nathan Gross, one of his colleagues, mentioned in his memoirs. Of course, Alexander Ford does not represent all the survivors, all the Polish Jews who were in Poland. And I think the Polish Jews after the Holocaust, this description is very wide. there was significant diversity among Polish Jews after the war, and it was changing over the next decades based on their post-Holocaust experience, their willingness to emigrate to Israel or to other countries, but also based on their, for example, intermarriage interaction with non-Jews. The number of Jews in Poland was also decreasing after the Second World War. Here we see just the visual way of example of showing how the number of Jews in Poland dropped over the decades after the Holocaust. And certainly for those Polish Jewish intellectuals who stayed in Poland, it was, in a sense, a choice. Should we create for the Jews? Should we create for the Poles? Should we create something that is universal? But many of them also didn't in any way emphasize on their Jewish identity. They focus on their Polish identity. And so was the case of Jan Brzechwa, who was very creative after the Second World War, who was almost considered as a national writer, who was known to everyone, who shaped with his writing, with his novels, with her stories for children, he shaped the generations of Poles after the Second World War. And that's why I allow myself to present him surrounded by Polish kids in the 1960s. He was known as Polish writer. There were only a few people or a low percentage of people who knew of his Jewish background. And even recently, a few years ago, there was a big surprise in Poland when some of the schools, public schools named after Jan Brzechwa, discovered, people who were attending those schools discovered that Jan Brzechwa, in fact, was of Jewish origin. And this raised some questions whether he's a good person to name Polish school after. Nevertheless, Jan Brzechwa is an iconic person, iconic writer for the generation of Polish kids. And even today, there are still children reading his novels and being fascinated by the stories that inspired them to discover new things. And we could see it at the exhibition of Szance, because Szance was also illustrating Brzechwa's works, and many people know Szance because of Brzechwa. On the other pole of Polish Jewish creativity and artistic world, there was also an attempt to promote Jewish culture in its all forms, including Jewish theater plays, translating Jewish novels into Polish, and presenting it as part of not only Jewish culture but also Polish culture. Then the question was whether the novel or play written in Yiddish in Poland by Polish Jews is Polish, or it should be written in Polish primarily. Of course, there were many forms and many people dealing with the Holocaust past, as well as trying to create a brighter future for themselves and for the Jewish community. And among people who were considered as very influential artists and intellectuals, I have to mention Jonas Stern, Krakow-based artist. He was born in Eastern Galicia, but he lived in Krakow after the Second World War. He was also connected with Krakow even before the Second World War, being part of the Krakowian group, artist group. And after the Second World War, he was active as an artist, as a person, intellectual leader who shaped the generations of Polish artists. In his artworks, he paid tribute to those who perished in the Holocaust. He commemorated the Holocaust in his many artworks. But at the same time, he was also trying to escape the dark past, the dramatic past, by creating completely different art, colorful, with some Cubist influences and some portraits. So he was very diverse in his artworks, and we see certain dichotomy that we also see in other works by writers, artists, that some of them had like two paths. One is thinking about the past, another one is thinking about the future. Of course, in the post-Holocaust era, many individuals left Poland as well. It was because of reuniting with their family members who survived and emigrated to either Israel, United States, or Western European countries, or simply being forced to leave, like it happened in 1968 as the result of anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic campaign that had very that had huge consequences for the intellectual circles combining this Polish and Jewish identity. There were many Polish, Jewish intellectuals who considered themselves mostly Polish, who worked in the universities, who worked for Polish state offices, who were independent artists, who were writers, filmmakers, and many of them were considered as people who were not welcome anymore in Poland by the communist regime as the result of the anti-Zionist campaign, as the result of some anti-Semitic rhetoric. Many of those people were forced to leave Poland because they were fired from their jobs. They couldn't basically make a living in Poland. And here is just in Polish, the list of professions represented among those who applied for emigration in 1968 and 69. And among them, most of the people were somehow involved in the intellectual life of Poland. Famous and very creative, very productive academics, scientists, journalists, writers, musicians, painters, actors, you name it. So really, Poland lost the huge number of those who could shape different Poland. And I think one of the best lines summing up the whole group that was lost by Poland then is the line by Henrik Grinberg, who wrote that here they left more than they possessed. That those intellectuals left enormous impact on Polish culture. They, before they left, they contributed to Polish art, Polish culture in general, to Polish literary world, to Polish film. And without them, suddenly everything was less sophisticated, less creative. And this is certainly a turning point for those who considered themselves Poles, but who were forced to leave Poland. And I remember many conversations with those Jews who were forced to leave Poland in 1968 and 69, and they told me that they basically became Jews after leaving Poland. That before they left, they considered themselves at heart truly Polish, but this experience forced them to discover their Jewishness. And after 1968, whoever was still in Poland had to be aware of some consequences of what happened in 68 as the result of March 68. Certainly many Polish Jewish writers had to reconsider their writing. There were not so many opportunities for them to work, create, and they were not welcome in certain Polish right-wing or Polish communist circles. And this was a very complex situation, also given the fact that the communist regime forbidden any promotion of Jewish writings, Jewish culture in Poland. And that was also the case even in the 70s, when, for example, during the time when Isaac Bashevis Singer received the Nobel Prize in Literature, this fact was basically almost ignored by the communist authorities, but nevertheless it inspired many intellectuals in Poland to read his novels, but also to reflect on the missing part of the missing Jewish part of Polish culture, and they started to reflect on Jewish influence on Polish culture in general. And this included also the culture in Yiddish, the post-war Jewish writings in Yiddish. I do not have time to discuss this whole spectrum of Yiddish writing, newspapers, magazines, and Yiddish cultural events in Poland. But whoever is interested in it, I do recommend the book by my colleague Magdalena Ruta, who did research on the post-Holocaust Yiddish writings and more Yiddish culture. And of course, this included Yiddish theater, which was active after the war, after the Holocaust in Poland, but its identity, its form was changing. First, it was created by Jewish artists for Jewish audience. Then suddenly it was Jewish artists for non-Jewish audience. And only recently, it's again the Jewish theater for Jewish audience, although it's not the Jewish theater in Yiddish for Yiddish-speaking audience. And certainly, if we talk about the contribution and the impact of Polish Jews on Polish culture in the context of the post-Holocaust period, I have to mention this couple, Szymon Szurmi and Golda Tencer, who are the leaders, who were the leaders in case of Szymon Szurmi of Jewish theater in Poland, and who also consulted many theater plays and films on Jewish topics or related to Jewish culture and heritage in Poland. And just a few lines on what happened next and what is happening today, because certainly this Jewish influence or Polish Jewish influence on Polish culture and art continues still today. But again, after the communist period, it changed again dramatically. The first changes started to happen in the late 1970s and 1980s, when a group of Polish Jewish intellectuals formed an informal organization or group, Jewish Flying University, and they basically studied together to learn what it means to be Jewish, what it meant for them to be Polish Jews, and how it could be translated to their non-Jewish friends. Then there was the activity of Social Cultural Association of Jews in Poland. And despite the forecast that the Jewish life in Poland was over, the Jewish life in Poland revived. And it started with culture, created by or reminded by non-Jews during the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow, but also later on in other cities. And it was like the reminder of the Jewish past, the Jewish culture, but it was also in some way preparing the Polish society to absorb the reviving Jewish community. And this trend of organizing cultural events, promoting Jewish culture in Poland is happening today. And this also includes the art or more general culture created by Jews in Polish and considered as Polish. One of the elements of such culture is klezmer music, but also other types of music created by Polish Jews, promoted by Polish Jews. And we have various initiatives that started with Leopold Kozłowski, the last klezmer of Galicia, but they are also continued till today by young artists, young musicians who remind us of almost forgotten musicians, Jewish musicians like Mieczysław Weinberg and others. Then there was the opening of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which was another turning point in acknowledging the heritage of Polish Jews and also acknowledging the impact, the influence of Polish Jews on Polish culture. This is the museum that shows the integrated Jewish history, integrated into Polish history. And we can find a lot of examples and a lot of names I have mentioned already in this museum. The opening of this museum was also very important, and I think it was in some way symbolic, because during the opening some shift was marked. Here we see the picture of two persons, two Polish Jews who were opening the museum. One is a Holocaust survivor, the representative of the old generation, one of the most, today, most important and most almost iconic intellectuals, Marian Turski. And here it is, this young girl who represents the new generation. So it's like a passing the responsibility of protecting, of remembering Jewish heritage in Poland to the young generation. And of course, we see these examples of multi-generational families and different attitude to the Jewish past in many cases. I chose one example of the Kornhauser family. Some of you might know Julian Kornhauser, who is a very well-known poet in Poland, or his son, who is one of my colleagues at the Jagiellonian University, a writer, Jakub Kornhauser. And they are very often identified with their Jewish background. However, they are also identified with Agata Kornhauser Duda, who is Poland's first lady. So we see here different, also different life paths and different choices. Here we also, for the lack of time, I just present one group photo of Jewish periodicals that were published in Poland over the past few decades. Unfortunately, some of them are no longer being published, but this is very important. This was a very important, or has been a very important platform for sharing the Jewish perspective with non-Jewish readers, and a lot of young writers, journalists, artists created pieces for those periodicals, and they are certainly an example of Jewish influence on Polish culture, because very often they serve as the reference to a Jewish art, Jewish culture. And I would like to mention also the returns, because we have some artists and intellectuals who return to Poland, who have returned to Poland recently, and one of them is Marek Cycła, a worldwide known artist, ceramic maker, who lived in Israel and in New York, and now he lives in Poland, in Kielce, and works with Polish well-known ceramics factory, Chmielów. But he is also combining his crafts, his artistic activities with commemorating the past. He is the author of some memorials in Kielce, and certainly it's the high quality of art and design, and an amazing contribution to Polish art of commemoration today. And I would like to finish with kind of making circle and coming back to Julian Tuwim. Here we see the group of young Jews, young Polish Jews, who use the line from Julian Tuwim today when they identify themselves, when they protest, when they are active, when they create. And they certainly treat Julian Tuwim as one of their inspirations. And among them, there is the new generation of Polish art, Polish Jewish artists like Zuzanna Herzberg and others. And if you don't know, I do recommend to read the text by Julian Tuwim titled "We Polish Jews." Here I include just a fragment of it. It's a longer piece. It's a very very emotional, very dramatic reflection on the identity, on the history, and what it means to live in between the Jewish and the Polish world. And certainly it is a very actual, it's very up to date today. It's very often used when Polish Jews have to identify themselves and have to declare their identity. For those of you who would like to know more about post-Holocaust Poland, including the history of art, culture, literary world, I do recommend the academic publication Jewish Presence in Absence. It's the group publication, and it's certainly worth reading. And with this, I will finish, although I have many more topics to discuss, but I know we already exceeded the time, so I will stop here, hoping that we will have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was such a rich and educating overview. I feel that I learned a lot, and it went deeper to this conversation of identity that I think all of us are dealing with. So here I see the first question. Please feel free to type in the chat. Maybe this will be the most convenient way of asking questions.
Okay. I will show this fragment from Julian Tuwim's We Polish Jews, but you can find it online. It's available in both Polish and English.
Great. Before we jump into more questions, I want to stop for a minute to extend my gratitude to you, to the Galicia Jewish Museum. It has been such a journey with them, with bringing the exhibit here, with learning so much. Toby Foundation, and it was such a great help. And we really feel fortunate to have the exhibit and to have these kind of lectures to learn more. And so if anyone wants to ask some question, I know it was really deep and you answered many of my questions. Um,
I can read Elizabeth Schanzer's comment. As you can imagine, I can identify strongly with your topic. I definitely can imagine that, and thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing your thoughts on this topic on many occasions.
You're
Elizabeth,
welcome. This is
oh, yeah.
meaningful for me too, to listen to this, because it's something I've struggled with my whole life from my past and so on. And again, it's a topic. Identity is a topic all in of itself, I know.
Yes,
So thank you.
Thank you. It's a very complex topic, and I was just trying to highlight some ideas, but of course, it's this story of multiple changes. These people I mentioned, and I mentioned just a few of them. They lived through different epochs. Each period, like interwar Poland, Holocaust, post-Holocaust, created different conditions for their identity. And each time they had to ask themselves the question, who we are, who do we want to be? So this is really a struggle in many cases, because these people were sometimes encouraged to be Poles. And on the other occasions, they were completely discouraged or threatened for being or trying to become Poles. It's really difficult, and it's an ongoing discussion about identity. I've Elizabeth, you wanted to
share? Yeah, I can say, I know that, and the impact not only of the Polish Jews in the interwar period, and I'm speaking for my family, Jan Martin Schanzer, and my parents, my grandparents, the whole thing. I mean, on the side of the Schanzer family, besides myself, I only have two other cousins, one in Israel and one in Australia, remain Jewish. Everybody else, including my grandmother, my father's sister, my aunt, all converted. And just because they could not deal with the subject anymore and so on, and also to better themselves and so on in the interwar period and even before. So it's impacted me for my generation too, and my growing up. So all these discussions I relate to, and I really, really appreciate your insights and everything that you've said. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would just share with you some facts, recent facts from the two national censuses in Poland recently, at the beginning of the 21st century and 10 years ago. In the first census, the number of Jews in Poland was only 1,055 people, which was really shocking, surprising. It certainly raised a lot of questions. 10 years later, the number was almost 8 times bigger. And the difference was the questions that was asked. In 2001, Jews had to choose between Jewish and Polish identity. So many of them chose Polish identity in the census. um, 10 years later, they were given the option of choosing the first identity, the second identity, and over 5,000 Polish Jews chose Jewishness and Polishness together. So I think it shows that it's still a question. And I'm very curious what will be the results of national census that is organized this year, because the same option of choosing the national identity, ethnic identity, and also religion was given. So we'll see what is the result, if there is any progress, or if there is any effect that political situation in Poland had on this identity issue.
Thank you. Very interesting. I wanted to bring to your attention a question from Daphne Talmor. Can you talk more of the choices of writers like Henrik Greenberg, who continue to create in Polish, but in the United States, not Israel or Poland?
Yes, thank you. In fact, I saw this question and was going to deal with to answer it. I mentioned Henrik Greenberg as one of the examples of the generations, as one of the individuals who created in Poland, but who were in some way forced to leave Poland as the result of anti-Semitism, political changes, and of course he decided to create abroad, to write abroad in Polish, because he's still having this strong connection to Poland. He follows what is happening in Poland, but at the same time, his feelings are very bitter. I mean, he feels in some way betrayed by what was happening and what is happening in Poland. Of course, his a Jewish identity or his national identity was not could not be defined, or he didn't define himself as a Zionist. He didn't decide to go to Israel. He chose otherwise. But there are many others who emigrated to Israel and who continued to write in Polish in Israel. There's the whole group of writers, journalists who published in Polish for years, for decades in Israel. And they continued working on Polish history, on Polish literature, on Polish art and culture in general. To mention just people like Nathan Gross or Richard Lev, or many others. But of course, I couldn't mention all the names. I didn't. I was struggling to mention the names of the filmmakers, of the film directors, who even when they emigrated, even if they create their pieces, their work abroad, they are still talking. They're discussing Poland in one way or another. Just to mention people like Agnieszka Holland, who lives in Poland, but she spent a lot of time abroad. To mention Roman Polanski, who is living abroad, but still focuses on the situation in Poland. So even if those intellectuals, artists, even if they create in other languages, they also keep some topics from Poland on their agenda, and they follow the situation in Poland. They reflect on it, and they try to be involved. They try to make some impact. We see it today. We've seen it 10 years ago. Many of them helped Polish intellectuals to start their career abroad. So I think there are multiple ways of expressing the warm feelings towards Poland, expressing the care for Poland, for Polish culture, art, and heritage. and we see it among those who live abroad, and Henrik Grinberg is one of them, even with sometimes very bitter words, but he cares. Do we have any other questions? If not, I guess it's the time to rest a little bit.
No, we have another. As a Pole, I would like to express my gratitude. My childhood was all about Tuwim, Brzecha, and Shanzer. I grew up enchanted by their creations, and until last week, I had no idea that my beloved illustrator, John Martin Shanzer, had a Jewish background. Not until I stepped totally by coincidence into JCC exhibition. Thank you. Oh, that's a really lovely way to end.
Absolutely, absolutely. If it was only for this comment, it was worth to create the exhibition and to make the traveling version to be available. Yeah.
Thank you so much for expanding our knowledge and bringing so much richness. So thank you. Have a good night over there, and have a nice day over here. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.